All right, fuck the small talk. Let's get right into this messed up shit that went down in Germany on New Year's Eve 2015.
Yeah, sounds good.
We're talking mass sexual assaults,
Yeah.
mainly in Cologne, but it spread to other cities too.
Yeah, it did.
Over 1,200 women reported getting attacked.
It was a night that was supposed to be about celebration and fireworks,
Jesus.
but it quickly turned to absolute chaos.
So set the scene for us. What the hell happened in Cologne?
Okay, so picture the Cologne Cathedral Plaza.
Hey.
New Year's Eve, the place is absolutely packed with people. Fireworks are going off, everyone's drinking, having a good time.
That was pretty typical for New Year's, right?
Yeah, until it wasn't. It turned into a fucking hunting ground.
What do you mean?
These large groups of men were encircling women, groping them, tearing their clothes off. It was a level of aggression that shocked even the police, you know?
Wait, so you're saying this wasn't just some random drunken idiots. This was organized.
The scale of it, the way the attacks happen, everything points to it being planned.
That's seriously fucked up.
Imagine being surrounded by a mob of men, hands all over you, nowhere to go.
Oh, Jesus.
Some of the women, they were even robbed while they were being assaulted. It was pure pandemonium.
It sounded like the police were caught with their pants down.
They were completely overwhelmed, thousands of people, sudden violence breaks out, it's dark, fireworks are going off. It was a nightmare, logistically.
I bet.
And then there's another layer to this whole mess that made it even worse.
Okay, lay it on me.
The police reports, the witnesses, they all describe the attackers the same way. Men of North African or Arab appearance.
Ah, shit. So there's a racial component to this whole thing. How'd the media handle that?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The major news outlets, they didn't report the ethnicity of the attackers right away. Some people called it a media blackout.
You mean a cover-up?
Some said it was political correctness gone mad. Others said it was a deliberate attempt to avoid stirring up racial tensions during the whole migrant crisis.
So basically, they were trying to sweep the whole race thing under the rug.
It was a complex situation. Remember, Germany was taking in a huge number of refugees at the time.
Yeah.
Reporting on the ethnicity of the attackers was a potential powder keg.
I bet the right-wingers had a field day with this.
Oh, absolutely. They jumped all over it, saying this was proof that migrants were dangerous, that Germany was losing control. And of course, the left accused them of exploiting the situation for their own agenda. It was a shit show.
So what's the official explanation for how this all went down? Did the German authorities ever figure out why Cologne exploded that night?
The Bundeskriminalamt, which is basically their FBI, they did a deep dive into the events and identified 6 key factors that contributed to the chaos.
Okay, so this wasn't just some random, isolated incident.
Not at all. And understanding these factors is key to preventing something like this from happening again.
All right, hit me with those 6 factors.
First, they acknowledged the cultural context. They were careful not to make generalizations, but they said that in some cultures, sexual harassment by groups of men is more common.
Wait, so they're saying that in some cultures, groping a bunch of women is considered a good time?
Yeah.
I don't buy that.
It's a touchy subject, and it's easy to fall into stereotypes. But their report mentions studies showing big cultural differences in how people view women and acceptable social behavior.
Okay, so cultural context. What else is on the list?
They also pointed to group dynamics.
Yeah.
You know, in a big anonymous crowd, people lose their sense of personal responsibility.
Yeah, that mob mentality shit. When you're surrounded by a bunch of assholes doing whatever they want, you're more likely to join in. What else?
Well, they also talked about alcohol and drugs.
Of course.
It was New Year's Eve. People were drinking like it was the end of the world.
Yeah.
Booze lowers inhibitions, makes people more aggressive. You throw that into a huge hyped up crowd, and you got a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so we got cultural differences, mob mentality, booze. What about the fact that most of these guys were migrants or refugees? Did the report address that at all?
They did. And it's a crucial part of the whole thing. They talked about this thing called disinhibition due to lack of social ties and integration.
What the hell does that mean?
Try to put yourself in their shoes. You're a young guy, you just arrived in a foreign country, everything's different, you don't speak the language, you're isolated, you don't even know what's going to happen to you tomorrow.
Yeah, I can see how that could lead to some serious frustration.
Exactly. But it doesn't give anyone the right to assault women.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
But I guess understanding this stuff helps explain how things escalated so quickly.
Yeah, sometimes these things that seem like isolated incidents are actually connected to bigger social and economic forces.
So it's not just about individual assholes, it's about the context. Okay, what were the other 2 factors?
The 5th one was the lack of police intervention.
They were totally overwhelmed, right?
Exactly. That sense of I can get away with anything can embolden people to do some pretty messed up stuff.
Yeah, like those looters during riots. It's like they think they're invincible when no one's watching. What's the last piece of this fucked up puzzle?
The last one's probably the most controversial. They suggested that some of the aggression stemmed from the uncertainty surrounding asylum and work prospects.
You mean because these guys were stuck in limbo, their lives on hold, not knowing what their future holds?
Right. That kind of pressure cooker situation can lead to some pretty desperate and violent behavior.
So they're saying that being stuck in a bureaucratic nightmare could push someone over the edge. I mean, it's not an excuse, but I can see how it might be a factor.
It's a complicated issue, and it's important not to generalize. Not all migrants or refugees are criminals. But we can't ignore the psychological toll that displacement and uncertainty can take on a person.
Okay, so let's recap. We got cultural context, mob mentality, booze, lack of integration, no cops around, and frustration with the asylum process. That's a lot to digest. So what happened after this whole shit show? Did Germany just try to sweep it under the rug?
Not exactly. There was a massive public outcry, people were pissed off, and the government had to respond.
I bet. This was happening right in the middle of the migrant crisis.
Exactly. The stakes were high. One wrong move could have caused a political earthquake.
I'm sure the right-wingers were loving it, using to fuel their anti-immigrant bullshit.
Oh, yeah, they're all over it.
But it wasn't just them, right?
No, there was widespread fear and anger across the board. People wanted answers. They wanted to know how the hell something like this could happen in Germany.
So what did the authorities do? Did they actually take any concrete steps to address the problem?
They did, but it was a tightrope walk. They had to show they were taking it seriously without fueling anti-migrant sentiment or looking soft on crime.
Sounds like a political minefield. So what'd they do?
One of the first things they did was tighten up the laws. They made groping a specific sex crime and made it easier to deport migrants convicted of sex offenses.
Basically saying, don't fuck around in Germany or you're out of here.
Yeah, they were trying to deter future crimes and reassure the public that they were doing something, but the legal changes were only part of it.
What else? Did they try to tackle any of those underlying social issues we talked about?
To some extent, yes. They increased funding for integration programs, language classes, job training for migrants and refugees. The idea was to help them integrate faster, reduce isolation, and hopefully prevent this kind of shit from happening again.
So a carrot and stick approach. Punish the bad guys and try to prevent future problems by addressing the root causes.
That's a good way to put it, but not everyone was happy with this approach.
Sure, everyone had an opinion on how to handle this mess. What were the main points of contention?
Some people argued that the government wasn't doing enough to address the cultural differences that might have contributed to the attacks. They wanted more cultural sensitivity training for migrants and refugees.
You mean like teaching them how to behave properly in Germany? Kind of sounds like looking down on them, don't you think?
It's a tricky issue. You don't want to impose your values on others or come across as insensitive. But at the same time, every society has its own rules and expectations for behavior.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike.
Right.
What did the other side say? The ones who disagreed with the government's response?
They argued that the government was overreacting, that Cologne was an isolated incident blown out of proportion by the media and right-wing politicians. They were worried about a backlash against innocent migrants and refugees.
So they were concerned about innocent people getting caught in the crossfire.
Right. They thought the focus should be on integration, not criminalization.
Sounds like a classic left-right divide. So what was the overall impact of the government's response? Did it actually work?
It's hard to say for sure. Crime rates involving migrants and refugees didn't really go up in the years after Cologne. But it's impossible to know if that was because of the government's policies or something else entirely.
So the jury's still out on whether they actually solved the problem. But one thing's for sure, Cologne left a mark on Germany.
Oh, absolutely. It was a traumatic event that shook people's sense of security and had a huge impact on the political landscape.
Okay, we've covered the immediate aftermath, the political fallout, and the government's response. But what about the guys who actually did this? Were any of those assholes brought to justice?
That's a question a lot of people were asking, and it's not a simple answer. Identifying and prosecuting the attackers turned out to be really difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. It was chaos. So many people. Dark, fireworks going off. Must have been a nightmare for investigators.
It was. And there's another factor that made things even harder. Some of the victims didn't want to come forward.
Why wouldn't they report it?
A lot of reasons. Some were traumatized, some were ashamed, some were afraid of retaliation, some maybe didn't prove in the police, and some might have been undocumented migrants who were scared of getting deported if they came forward.
So basically, a lot of these women were silenced by fear and shame. That's fucked up.
It is, and it shows how difficult it can be to prosecute sexual assault cases, even in countries with good legal systems.
Okay, so let's talk about the cases that did go to court. Were any of those perpetrators actually convicted?
Some were, but the numbers are pretty shocking. The Bundeskriminalamt estimated that over 2,000 men were involved in the attacks across Germany.
2,000, Jesus Christ, how many were actually charged?
By July 2016, they had started legal proceedings against 120 suspects for sexual violence.
120 out of 2,000.
Yeah.
That's pathetic. What about the ones who were convicted? Did they get serious time?
The first two convictions in Cologne were handed down in July 2016. A 21-year-old Iraqi and a 26-year-old Algerian got suspended one-year sentences for sexual assault.
Suspended sentences. Are you serious? Those bastards got off with a slap on the wrist.
It was a controversial decision, sparked a lot of anger and protests. People felt the sentences were too lenient, didn't reflect the seriousness of the crimes.
I don't blame them. Those women deserve justice, and the system failed them. What about the other cases? Did any of the perpetrators get real punishment?
There were a few cases where they got prison sentences, but most of those convicted got suspended sentences or fines.
So basically, most of the guys who got caught got away with it. It's like the justice system cared more about protecting the perpetrators than getting justice for the victims.
It's complicated. The legal system has its own rules, like the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof.
Yeah, I get it. But it still feels like a massive injustice. Those women went through hell, and most of the guys who did it walked away scot-free.
It's a reminder that even in developed countries with strong legal systems, justice isn't always served.
Okay, we've talked about the legal fallout. But what about the bigger picture? How did these attacks change Germany as a whole?
The Cologne attacks were a turning point for Germany. They sparked a nationwide debate about immigration, integration, and the role of women in society.
Okay, let's dive into that. How did the attacks affect attitudes towards immigration?
It definitely threw fuel on the fire. Before Cologne, Germany was pretty open to refugees, but after, public opinion shifted. People started questioning Merkel's open-door policy, and those anti-immigration parties got a boost.
Yeah, I bet those right-wing assholes were loving it. Proof that all immigrants are dangerous, right?
It played right into their narrative, but it wasn't just the fringe. A lot of regular Germans started feeling uneasy about all these migrants coming in, especially young men from cultures with different views on women.
So Cologne basically changed the whole conversation about immigration, from welcome refugees to shut the borders.
It's more complex than that. People genuinely wanted to help those fleeing war and persecution, but Cologne brought in this element of fear. People worried about their safety, their culture, whether Germany was losing control.
You can only stretch a rubber band so far before it snaps.
Yeah. Cologne was the breaking point for a lot of Germans.
So it wasn't just about immigration.
Right. Cologne also sparked a debate about women in society and how to protect them from sexual violence.
Okay, let's get into that. How did Cologne change the discussion about women's rights in Germany?
It forced people to face some uncomfortable truths about sexual violence, about victim blaming, about how women are silenced.
Yeah, that whole boys will be boys crap.
Yeah.
Cologne blew that out of the water.
Absolutely. And it led to some positive changes. More activism, campaigns about sexual violence. Women started speaking up, demanding stricter laws, better support for victims.
So Cologne, as awful as it was, kind of forced some much-needed progress.
Yeah, in some ways. It forced Germany to have that talk about sexual violence and making a safer, more equal society for women. A conversation they should have had a long time ago.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. The attacks, the political fallout, the legal battles, the long-term impact. What's the big takeaway here? What can we learn from this whole mess?
I think Cologne shows that even in a seemingly progressive country like Germany, prejudice and social tensions can explode in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
And these things have ripple effects that last for years.
It's not just about the immediate trauma, it's the long-term damage.
Yeah. Cologne changed Germany, it changed Europe, it changed how we think about immigration, security, women's rights.
We got to keep talking about this stuff. Learn from our mistakes, fix the problems that cause violence and inequality, work together to build a better world. Big ask, I know.
It is, but it's worth fighting for.
Well said. I think that's a good place to wrap things up. This has been a heavy one, but hopefully you learned something. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.